Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Danielle Johns with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Improve Community Reporting to Increase Trust for Your Tribe. We're pleased that you've joined us today. And before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Today's presenters from Moss Adams are Annie Rose Favreau, Senior Manager, and Kate Ethridge, Manager. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console for your convenience. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Annie Rose to get the presentation started.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We are very much looking forward to sharing more about community reporting with you all. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to start out just talking about some of the opportunities and challenges that we've encountered as we've worked with tribal organizations doing community reporting, and really focusing on how to better use community reports to communicate the positive impact of government services and really tell the story of your tribal organization with a focus on increasing transparency and accountability and all that good stuff. Then we're going to get into some of the practical strategies and best practices that you can use to improve your reports. And finally, really thinking about some of the ideas for how you can make your reporting process consistent and sustainable over time as well. So before we get going on all of that content, we did want to learn a little bit more about who all is in the audience with us today. So our first polling question is just to learn a little bit more about you. So are you a member of tribal council or a member of another governance group like a committee or a board or commission? Are you a member of staff within a tribal government or enterprise? Or are you representing an entirely different organization as well? So we've brought that polling question up. It'd be fantastic. We'll give you about 30 seconds to fill that out. And once enough of you have taken the poll, we will see the results. And I would say most frequently when I am working with different organizations who are really focused on community reports, I would say a lot of times we get questions from tribal council or leadership, basically saying we've heard from our community, we really want more ability to communicate out. And so we see the community report as an important piece of that. But sometimes this work is led by kind of an intrepid staff member who has been assigned the role of making a community report happen. So I'm really curious to see who is in our audience today. Kate, do you have any predictions for where you think our audience might fall out?
Yeah, I was thinking about this too, and I'm very curious to see who all is here, because I do know that I've heard from many council members and such that this is something that they're aware is very important for their community members. But then a lot of times, you know, the people that are creating the reports and those types of things are, you know, someone else outside of council. So I feel like it might be a good mix, but kind of excited to see what the results are too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fantastic. It looks like we do have quite a few folks from that employee level, folks who are engaged in this work, I'm assuming, because you have been tasked with creating this, making this happen, as well as some folks from leadership and some from others. So that is great. All right, well then, moving us right along, Kate, do you want to talk a little bit more? We're already using the term community reporting, but want to talk a little bit more about what we mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this word gets thrown out a lot. Community reporting. Well, what exactly is that? And so we wanted to just share a basic definition of it just to start the presentation off. So community reports are documents that are used to share information with the constituents about the activities and accomplishments of the tribal governments or enterprises. And I've definitely seen it done both ways, where a tribal government will issue their own, as well as an enterprise might issue their own. Sometimes they're combined, but really the main point is just being able to portray information outside of, you know, the general audit report that's being done annually to the constituents. Some other names for this report that I've heard and that may have been thrown around are citizen-centric reporting, as well as the popular financial report. But the whole point of this webcast is, why does this report matter? Why should you care and put in time, effort, potentially even money and resources to create something to pass down to your constituents? And the biggest piece, like I mentioned on the last slide, is creating this communication between the government and the community. People that work at the government are exposed to everything that's happening within the government on a daily basis. And the community sometimes doesn't get that flow of information as easily or as quickly. So these reports really increase transparency and trust between both sides. It also helps increase accountability between the government and the constituents, so that the community can really see results of certain things rather than just hearing about potential things happening. And that goes into the next one of being able to communicate the positive impact that the government is really having on the community as a whole. There is also potentially fulfilling a requirement that is part of the tribal goals and missions. But for the most part, I feel like those top 3 bullet points are the primary reason that this is so important. Now, this area is more talking about different types of community reports. So the one that you all probably first think of when you hear this word community reports are these annual comprehensive community reports from the government and or enterprises. So these are much more comprehensive, are usually issued annually, sometimes quarterly as well, depending on, you know, how much you want to present at a certain time. And that's the type of report that we're going to focus on the most. But just to give you an idea of some other ways you can present this type of information is dashboard alerts. And these dashboard alerts are more presented on websites that the government has, email blasts, those types of things. And they're focusing on more specific key performance indicators, or KPIs for short. And Annie Rose will be talking a lot more about what KPIs are and how to best present those in just a few. Another type of way that you can do these are individual reports out to the community on specific things. So for example, a large construction project, you know, maybe you're adding a new bridge or a new healthcare facility, and giving an individual report that's more detailed and specific for that type of activity. Or it could be more specific to a program, and instead of being more detailed in a large report of each of the different programs, maybe you send out individual reports that are more specific to larger programs that you have.
Great. So regardless of sort of the format, we're going to assume for the rest of this conversation, at least, we're really focusing on that high-level, comprehensive annual community report. But regardless of the format, we know that putting together an excellent community report can be really challenging for a variety of reasons. And the first one we have on the list, I would say, is the most common one that we run into for sure, which is not enough time and not enough resources. In particular, not enough staff time to get this work done in the way that you wish it to get done. And that is especially true if you don't have strong and consistent processes, if you don't have standard ways of collecting data, or sometimes even if the systems that your data is stored in, if those are not integrated, if the data itself is not great, all of that can make it even more challenging because it makes it a lot more time intensive to do this type of work. So we absolutely recognize that this is a real challenge, and we're hoping that as we go through, we'll be sharing some practical ways that we've seen other organizations overcome some of these challenges. But I certainly want to highlight that not enough time and resources is absolutely one that I don't think I've run into a single organization that felt like, yeah, we have exactly what we need on this front. It's always going to be a little tricky there. The other thing that I wanted to highlight right up front is lack of coordination between departmental information. Anytime you're doing a community report, it's going to involve getting information from multiple departments if you're trying to report out on what are we doing as a government as a whole. And anytime you're doing that, that's going to involve collaboration and trying to bring together information from different areas within tribal government. And that in and of itself can be really, really challenging, especially if you don't have, for example, one strong champion for this work that's really leading it, pushing it forward. A lot of times what I'll see is kind of this is given as a task to all of the department directors, for example. We're creating a community report together, and maybe one person is gathering the information, but really the expectation is that all of the department directors are supporting it, which is great, but it can make it really easy for the ball to get dropped in that environment. So we'll be talking a little bit more too about sort of how can we make these processes more successful given the high degree of coordination that is needed. And we'll go into more depth on the rest of the elements that I have here. We'll be talking a bit more about if you don't have meaningful measures or pieces, sort of data points that you can include in the report, that can mean that your report is basically not kind of grounded in strong data points that you can be sharing back to your community. If you have too much narrative and content, sometimes we run into this where it'll be a community report that's just a wall of text, right? It's paragraph after paragraph of information, which sometimes the information is excellent. It can be really, really interesting, useful information. But when it's presented where it's just this kind of flood of words coming at you, that's not the most friendly and accessible way of sharing that content. Sometimes we'll run into this thing where what's in the community report and what the stated organizational goals are don't appear to have any relationship with each other. And a lot of times the reason that that happens is because what it's easy to report on, to measure, to track, it might not be aligned with what are the ultimate goals that we have as an organization. And if you're seeing that misalignment, it can be really confusing, honestly, as a community member to say, okay, here's the goals that we have. So why are we hearing about all of this other work that may or may not have a direct connection with those goals? And then finally, Kate's going to talk a lot more about this, but lack of visuals or graphics. Again, this is just one more way, and you'll see this kind of as a theme as we're going through here. We want the community report to have different types of information presented in different ways because it increases the accessibility of that information. Some of your readers are going to absolutely love having a narrative and a story to go with it. Some of them will only be looking for, give me the data, give me the key measures here. And some of them, it'll be really difficult for them even to engage with the work unless they see a really fantastic visual, if you have visual learners within your community. So we want to get kind of a mix going here, and the visuals and graphics can can be a really fantastic way of doing that. But it's difficult to get those in there as well. This is a really common challenge of we don't have, again, time, energy, or resources to add these things in. So we want to recognize that all of these things can make this work pretty challenging to get out the door and to make sure that you have a really strong community report. But one of the reasons, and again, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with those challenges that I was just talking about. One of the reasons why we want to highlight it, though, is to really kind of hit home, what does this mean for your organization or your leadership team if the community report is a challenge, or if you don't have a strong community report that you're able to share out? And there's a couple key factors that I wanted to highlight here. First and foremost is we see often just a waste of time. A lot of times we'll see staff and leadership spending significant amount of time gathering information that might not be as useful as it could be. And what that means is that you're not able to focus on the actual most important things of your job, especially within a government setting. So often, if you're a department director, you should be focused on what are the services we're providing, how are those getting out the door, how are we meeting community needs. And so putting together a report probably should never be like the most important thing on your list, but sometimes it can kind of take up this huge amount of space, energy, and time on an annual basis. So we definitely want to avoid that if possible. The second one, and well, I'm going to go back and forth and say all of these are the most important, but I think probably this one actually is the most important, is if you don't have a strong community report, you're not able to paint this accurate picture of where are we as an organization. And I have organizational success on this slide, but this is true for both sides of that coin. What are we doing really well? Where are we potentially struggling? Where are the challenges that we've run into in the past year? We want to be able to accurately show a good, clear snapshot of the tribal government or the tribal enterprises in terms of the work that has happened within the past year. Because if you're not telling your story, this can really impact that community relationship between tribal government and your constituents. This can create a lack of trust, a lack of accountability if there's not a sense that accurate information is being shared there. And then the last piece, and these don't always go hand in hand, but often what I've found is if we're in a space where it's really challenging to put together a community report, a lot of times that's because the data itself to support the community report isn't available. And oftentimes that means that that data about how are we doing, what are our operations, how are we functioning, what do we look like financially, a lot of times that information actually isn't available to anybody. And that's why it's not ending up in the community report, because we're not actually able to efficiently track and view this information. And that's not great for your leadership team. You want to have this data for your leadership team, for the management team, for tribal council or your board, so that you can be using that information to actually make decisions. If you don't have that, a lot of times what we'll see is that decisions are potentially based more on anecdotes or sort of the squeakiest wheels that you're hearing from. And so certainly as we look across all of these areas, these are pretty significant impacts. So we want to make sure that community reporting is done effectively and efficiently. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next piece of our presentation here. But before that, I think we have our second polling question. Is that right, Kate?
Yeah, so before we really get into the meat of the presentation, how would you rate your organization's current community reports? So are you feeling really good about them, that the reports are useful and consistent? Are you feeling okay about them, that parts of the reporting works, but there's major room for improvement? Are you struggling and thinking that the community reports are needing significant improvement? Are they non-existent and you're wanting to work to start putting something together?
And my prediction here is that we're going to see a lot of B's and C's. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I think that that's probably going to be where I see the majority of the answers as well. But mainly just because that's why you're here. That's why you've joined this webcast, is hoping to put something better together.
Yeah. And sometimes I feel like we'll see, oh, great, we've got the results in here. So it looks like, great, we have some of you who are feeling good about your reports. That is absolutely fantastic. Hopefully some of these elements that we'll be talking about will help you kind of take it to even to the next level and really make improvements on what you already have in place. Looks like a good chunk of you are in that okay category. I feel like that's usually the sort of group that I work with, especially coming into organization, where we know parts of the report are working, but there is room for improvement. And then some of you in that struggling or non-existent. We actually have a good chunk of you in the non-existent category as well. So that's fantastic. A lot of this information I think will be really relevant if you're just starting out and needing some support in terms of where you are headed as well. So I'm going to keep us rolling here. And we wanted to share a bit more about some of the standard community reporting kind of best practices that we see out there. And we wanted to talk about them in 4 different sections: content and narrative, key performance indicators, visuals and graphics, and then finally we'll get to that data collection process as well. So thinking about content and narrative, there's a couple different pieces here that we wanted to talk about. First and foremost, and this is especially true for those of you who might be building out a community report for the first time, what is the content that we typically see here? So usually a community report has a welcome message. That's usually from tribal leadership, tribal council, welcoming folks, letting folks know what is within this report. There's usually some type of information that really speaks to who we are. And what I mean by that is sort of the profile of the tribal government organization. How many employees do we have? Who is our leadership team? What are the major enterprises? Just giving people a sense and kind of grounding them in the content of what is the context that we're going to be sharing all the rest of the information within. Then the meat of the report is the how are we doing question. And this is where you get to report out on what are the main operational things that we have in place, what are the primary initiatives that we have going on, what goals have we accomplished within the past year, what progress have we made. This is where we'll often see kind of a blend of some of that narrative that we were speaking to before, where we're kind of telling the story, describing, summarizing, providing information about, again, what has taken place in the past year. This, though, you'd also be mixing in some of your key performance indicators into this section where you can be reporting out on specific metrics that you've hit, goals that you've achieved, or targets that you've hit within that past year. As well as then in the next section, revenue and expenses. This is really about, you'll have a financial picture that you are painting here. How do we sit as an organization? And then finally, what's next? Oftentimes we'll kind of highlight what are some of the main upcoming initiatives that are really sort of top of mind, that we want folks to know about, that we want you to get excited about. And so kind of painting where we headed for the next year, so that when folks ideally pick up the annual report next year, they can also have that comparison of saying, here's where we were headed, and now here's where we're at. So in terms of standard practices, a lot of times we'll see a couple different things on this list. And Kate, welcome back. I'm not sure if you'd like to go through this one, or I can keep rolling. What's your preference?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Good.
So standard practices on the content and narrative. So this area is focusing on big items from the period. So it can be really easy because, you know, you're excited. You want to tell all of your constituents in the community about everything that's been happening during the period, whether it's for one quarter or if it's for the entire year. But it's really important that you focus on specific items and ones that you think are very key and that the community really needs to know about. And I'm not saying that's an easy task by any means. That is not an easy thing to do. But maybe starting with, you know, a bullet point of, these are all of the things I think would be really important. And then maybe talking about it as a group of a few different individuals and putting together some pros and cons of the different areas so you can really whittle it down to focus on those items that you can really highlight and bring the most data and information and content to your readers. For narrative, only use this when you're highlighting very, very important key areas. It can be really easy, and I'm an auditor. I do audit reports and such, so it's really easy to want to just write stuff down because you want to give all of the information to your reader, and you don't want there to be any confusion. But sometimes adding too much wording can produce the opposite result and can end up leading to more questions rather than answers. Reducing the use of jargon. Again, I'm an auditor. I understand there's lots of acronyms out there. There's lots of jargon that's very specific to the tribal government world, and trying to remember to bring that back and just having a conversation with your community through this report is very important. And acronyms are not necessarily a bad thing. We've already used one, in fact, KPIs, but just making sure the first time you use it that it's spelled out and then noting it with that. So it will help reduce any confusion when they're going through the content. And I think it's also really important to highlight not just the governmental activities, which are numerous. I absolutely understand that, but also making sure to bring in some enterprise information as well, because a lot of the governments that I've worked with have quite a few enterprises. And the enterprises are, the whole purpose that they're there is to bring in additional money and revenue to help the government produce even more resources for its community. And that's really important. And a lot of constituents and stuff want to know that information as well. And so kind of thinking about bringing in that element might be a good idea. And then using graphics and visuals to underscore the data that you're bringing in and the message that you're bringing in. We'll get a little bit more in depth into the visuals and graphics a little bit further down, and I have some examples of a few types of things that you can do to highlight that, where you have both narrative as well as visual aids to bring in and make sure that the information you really want your community to know is being. One thing that Annie Rose highlighted earlier is that there is definitely a difference between how you want your report structured to be. And there's looking at it from a department wise, or a department level, I guess, versus a goals level. And you can do a little bit of both. This isn't an either or situation. But just wanted to kind of outline the differences between the two and give some pluses and minuses of both of them going forward. So a department-based structure would be thinking about it on a departmental level. So, you have the finance department, you have, your health department, which then is broken down even more depending on the different type of health programs that you provide, or maybe there's housing, those kinds of things that you're putting together. Those are the departments. And when you're doing it that way, you're breaking it up by departments and then including specific information for that. So some pros is that the data collection is pretty straightforward with that. Your department managers, and I've met quite a few. They are on top of things. And, a lot of times part of their program involves compiling a bunch of data that has to then be, submitted to the federal government or submitted to council. That's really outlining and putting together how the department's doing, both financially and non-financially as well. And then there's also clear responsibilities for developing the content. Like I said, you have a program director or supervisor, and there's lots of levels, and they know their department really well. So that is definitely a pro. Those are some pros. Some cons is that it can be difficult to understand going between department initiatives and looking big picture of the government as a whole. Because, if the departments are putting them together, they have goals as well. And it's not that they don't align with the overall mission and goal of the tribe. It's just that they're a little bit more specific and they get a little bit more into the weeds of certain things. So making sure that they're, everything is well understood and organized. and then lack of direction to connect to the goals. So then on the other side, you have where you're just looking at what were the overall goals and strategies and thoughts of the government going into the year, and making that the structure to highlight the different areas for the year or whatever period of time. So they're, again, easy to understand cross-departmental initiatives. You've got one goal, and how did each of the departments kind of feed into that goal? There's also direction and connection towards the progress. So, you know, you can take the way the department has, each of the departments have compiled their data, and then have it all just flow together into, okay, these were the big projects. All of these departments were involved in this manner. This is what they got out of it. So let's compile that data to present for them. Cons, you know, it's not easy to put all of that together because you have to have someone outside of the departments that is looking through all of this data and then compiling it and putting it together so that it's presentable for the community. And that can be very time consuming. It also does make it so that, you know, it's another data collection process. So, you know, each department has collected theirs, but then you have to be able to weed through it. So it can just, it has its own set of challenges. So neither way is perfect. And again, you know, maybe having a hybrid of the two of some way, or different types of ways that you're presenting your report.
And before we move off of that, I actually wanted to just highlight, I'm working with an organization right now that is currently making this transition. They've had the department-based structure, and now they're shifting to a goals-based structure for their reports. And that's really because they were getting feedback from the community that it wasn't as meaningful to hear what every department is doing. They wanted to hear, are we making progress towards these goals? And so they're making this shift. And a couple things just to highlight sort of lessons learned from this crew. First and foremost, make sure you actually get buy-in from your department directors before making this transition. I think they presented it at a high level, and theoretically all the department directors were like, yes, this is great, let's do it. But they hadn't actually walked everyone through what the new process was going to look like. And so once they hit that new process, then they started getting a lot of pushback from the department directors, especially because it was the first year they were doing it, so things were a little bit clunky. So I would say give yourself some extra time. The first time, if you are making a transition to implement goal-based structure, it might not be like the smoothest transition ever, because you're gonna have to get a bunch of people on board. So just anticipate that. And I would say also, certainly, you know, try this more than once. We don't want to try to shift it over and then shift it back the next year. Ideally, you shift it over and give yourself enough time to get through this process at least twice to really see what are the potential impacts there too, if you are making a transition there. So key performance indicators. We've been talking about this a lot, but basically KPIs, these are your quantifiable measures. And usually, as Kate mentioned before, community reports contain this combination of kind of narrative descriptions, stories, summaries, and data points and KPIs. So there's that balance of information. And we mostly do that because we want to have this mix of the narrative, the qualitative information that you get there with the quantitative data from the KPIs, so that your community has what I would argue different but equally important information. You don't want one without the other. So a couple things here. There's different types of key performance indicators: financial, operational, and outcome. I know we're about halfway through, so I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on each one, but I certainly wanted to highlight some of the kind of the key areas that we'll see here. And most people are pretty familiar with financial KPIs, so I'm gonna start there. But these are the data points that basically say, is our organization financially healthy? Do we have enough resources to do what we're trying to do? Are we better off financially at the end of this year than we were at the beginning? Are we living within our means, or are we incurring debt? That type of thing. And so here, these are the bottom line pieces of data, because if you're not doing well financially, you're not going to be able to deliver on your mission, deliver your core services. And so a lot of times we'll see here measures of income, expenses, debt, liquidity, reserve funds, those types of things. These are really easy, especially for the financial KPIs. You can often Google sort of what are those standard set of financial KPIs and figure those out. These are, I would say, the most kind of straightforward ones that we have here. The next set are really around operational KPIs. And this is more thinking about, are we operating in an efficient manner? Are we providing good experiences to our community members, our clients, our constituents, and our employees? So a lot of times the operational KPIs, I kind of see them divided up. Oftentimes they'll be ones that are really related to internal operations. These are things like our employee turnover rate, our vacancy rate, our employee engagement rate, how quickly we're able to close the books each month. A lot of these things might not be as relevant or important to community members. A lot of times these are things that are really relevant and important to management to understand, are we operating effectively? But then there's the second set that I think are a little bit more relevant for community members, which are really related to service delivery. How well are we delivering our services? And so we'll see things there like average length of time it takes to receive a permit, for example. That might be an operational KPI that you report on. And then the last set, this is the one that I find to be most interesting, because these are the outcome KPIs. And these are they help us understand, are we achieving our long-term goals? Are we making progress toward our vision? Are we creating the impact that we want to see? And often, in order to determine what these outcome KPIs really should be, you can go back if you have a comprehensive plan, if you have a strategic plan. The outcome measures are really related to the vision that you have for the future of your community and the strategic goals that you have created. So if you have those types of planning documents in place, a lot of times you already have some outcome measures associated there. You may or may not be reporting them within your community report. But really, we want to understand, again, at the highest level, what do we want for our community and what is the tribal government aiming to do to make that happen? And these outcome KPIs, these can be fairly unique to each community, but we often see things like measures of safety, measures of community well-being, like the number of families who are housed or who are financially stable. We might see things like graduation or employment rates, things like that. This is also the place where if you do a community survey, some organizations will do an annual survey of community members to get their feedback on their perception of tribal government and the services that are provided. That type of community feedback can also be a really, really helpful outcome measure there. And just since I'm on my soapbox on community surveys, it is often relatively inexpensive to work with a survey firm, like an organization who specializes in administering this type of community survey, and they can help set it up so that your results are representative, statistically significant, and kind of take that burden off of staff so you're not having to do that in-house. So this is a great area where you can outsource some of this work to still create some really meaningful qualitative measures of just how people are feeling within the community as well. So I want to hear, we have our next polling question here. I would love to hear a little bit more about the current key performance indicators that your organization might be measuring. So I'm imagining there's going to be some section of you who feeling the same probably group who are feeling good about your community reports. You might be in A, where you're tracking a good selection of key performance indicators. Some of you might be in the B category, where you're tracking some KPIs, but they could be more meaningful. And then some might be in that C category of we're not actually tracking anything at this point in time. And kind of depending on where everybody falls out here, I have a couple more strategies that I'm going to share in terms of how to make your KPIs as meaningful as possible. But I would say a lot of folks, again, kind of end up in that B category. Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, well, and it's hard too, because like you were saying, there's three different categories really for KPIs. And I think it can be very easy to focus on the financial ones. I guess it depends on what part of the government you're in, but it can be very easy to just really look at those types of numbers because they're very solid. You know, a lot of times they've been audited, so they've got that. So, you know, I think it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, Bs, I could see that being the highest one for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious. All right, our predictions came true. We've got a good chunk of folks, over 50% in that B category, but great to see that some of you are in that A category, and not surprised to see that some of you are in the C category as well. I would say that is really, really common as well. So especially for those of you who are in the second two categories, but actually these strategies can apply to even if you have a good solid set of key performance indicators as well. There's a couple different things that I have used with groups to increase the meaning of your key performance indicators. Sometimes we'll run into groups that say, yeah, we've been tracking this information for a long time. It's feeling kind of stale. We don't know if it's still meaningful. Let's come back and kind of revisit where we're at and do an audit. These strategies can also be really helpful if you are generating new key performance indicators, if you haven't tracked these before. So the first strategy is the one that I often suggest, because this is going back to your strategic plan or your comprehensive plan. And what we'll do for this is kind of a very, very basic brainstorming activity, but you get your leadership team in a room, you look at the goals that you have laid out, and you ask folks to come up with the 3 most critical things that they would need to know and to track for each goal to know that you are making progress toward that goal. And so, for example, if you have a major goal of ensuring affordable housing, you'd probably need to know something like how many people in our community are in need of housing. That's probably a baseline that you would have to know. And so the purpose of this exercise is really to focus in, again, we limit it to three per goal because we want to be starting people to think about what makes something key, right? We don't want all the data in the world. We want the most critical information because that's really, we have limited bandwidth in multiple different ways. You can't collect a ton of information and you don't want to read and sift through a ton of information either. So this is one way, especially if your current KPIs are disconnected from your mission, if they don't have a lot of meaning, this can be a really nice touch point to go back and say, yeah, what are we trying to do at a baseline? What are the goals that we have set? And how can we make sure that our measurements are lining up with that? The second strategy, forced selection here, is basically if you have a set of key performance indicators already, you can ask your leadership team to select their top, I say 3 to 5. I've never gotten a group to do 3, but sometimes we'll get it down to just the top 5. If you could only track 5 things, what are the most important things to track? Another way to do this is if you have visual dashboards, if you have graphs of each of the pieces of data that you're tracking, you can say, here's your dashboard, and give like a physical sheet of paper and basically say, what can you fit practically on this single sheet of paper, essentially, in terms of the visuals. That's another way to kind of narrow it down. This, again, is very helpful if you're tracking a lot of information, but maybe it's not super meaningful. Or if you're tracking key performance indicators that are difficult to understand, especially some of the financial ones, they can be really important to know this information. If you are the finance director, or if you are on the finance committee, you might need to know all of these key pieces, but maybe that's not the most relevant thing for your community members, for example. And then the last strategy I have here, this is another kind of variation of strategy 2, but having your leadership team, and I've even done this with all staff as well, you put out a survey for this. Basically, you have your staff rate each KPI in terms of saying, is this meaningful and is this important? And you can get some really interesting feedback here because, again, depending on where you are in the organization, you might think this certain piece of data is incredibly important and nobody else even knows what you're talking about. So this can be a really great way of kind of getting on the same page with everybody. But this can also help shed if you have excess KPIs. If you have ones that really aren't meaningful and you're spending energy to track them, every single piece of data requires energy to track. So this can be a nice strategy to reduce those as well. Kate, want to talk about some visuals and graphics?
Yes. I'm really excited for this section because I don't know about everyone else in the audience, but I am such a visual person. And I know that there's lots of people that enjoy reading and and I do enjoy reading, don't get me wrong. But having those visuals there to add some impact to what you're trying to portray, I just think that it's so meaningful. And hopefully I can give you a couple of ideas, maybe something you haven't seen before, but some visuals and and graphic standard practices is using visuals to help tell your story. One thing that can be really easy, and I even find myself doing that when I put together presentations and those kinds of things, is I'll add something to a slide or to a report, and then I look back at it saying that didn't actually add anything to what I was trying to say. It just looked cute, or I thought it added a splash of color, but it wasn't necessarily needed. So making sure that the visuals are going to actually help tell the story you want. And then taking the reader's eyes on a predefined journey. So you have a page and you want it to go in a certain order. So trying to use the visuals and the narrative and the content to really streamline the reader's eyes. Include photos from the community too. I think that's really impactful and can add a little bit of flair as well. Visual graphics are great to highlight KPI data. I have a couple of examples next, as well as snapshot of the current status and trends. So a lot of graphs, those kinds of things. And then making sure that you stay consistent with your visuals. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're using the same visual over and over. It's more fonts, colors, design elements, making it so it's not distracting. So if you're using the same color concept throughout, it helps kind of flow things through a little bit better. And the reader doesn't even realize sometimes that they're enjoying it. It's just because of the flow of the color content and the design. So here's an example of how you could potentially display financial data in a graphic. So I pulled this one up and tried to add a few types of things that would be a little bit more specific to the government itself. But you have revenue and you could add amounts, but a lot of times you don't need to add the amounts. You just want to show what percentage of the revenues and expenses are making up these key categories. And then adding in the visual of, a pie chart, or in this case, I'm not even really sure what you would call that, but just the circle of what percent is actually really making that up can be very impactful to get your point across. Next is another example of how you could put this together. So it's a little bit busier, but it adds a little bit more narrative to it as well. And so you have a couple of pie graphs that are compiling data. And I guess the one thing I wanted to mention here too is, there's a lot of great products out there that you can use to create these yourself. So you already have the data and you just might need to look into a data analytic software that might be able to streamline the process of taking your data that you already have and making it into a visual. So, I think some common ones I've heard of are Tableau, Power BI, even just Excel, or not, well, Excel, but Microsoft Office type products as well work really well. So, trying to use resources that are in your budget to hopefully create impactful visuals from the data that you already have. The last one is actually from a city, and this was their way of portraying a current project that's underway. And I thought it was kind of cool, a little bit busy as well, but something to kind of think about as another way that you can incorporate data in a project that is kind of gets people a little bit more excited than just reading a full paragraph. So there is a narrative on the bottom left, but then it also is kind of showing different things that are happening and the progress that's being made.
Great. So
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, go for it.
All you.
I was going to say we've saved the best for last, the actual collection process itself, which I know is often folks' least favorite topic of all of these things, but it is really important. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time here at least. So thinking about how do we make sure that when we're gathering the information to go into a community report, that we're doing it in an efficient and effective way. I have listed here a couple of sort of the common practices that make this work run a little bit more smoothly. The first one here is just assigning a lead or a champion. Even if you know that this is going to be a cross-departmental collaborative effort, it is really helpful to have especially a member of your senior management team to be able to take the lead and say, yes, I'm moving this work forward. I'm helping to ensure that it's actually happening. This is just the person that's going to help you not drop any of those balls and make sure that folks are on track, because it is a lot of moving pieces. Now, that champion is not necessarily the person who's actually doing the day-to-day work of compiling information, but they're the ones that sort of are out there getting the message out, making sure that everybody's on board. The other thing that we've seen is documentation of data sources and key contacts. On the next slide, I'm going to show an example of a data dictionary, but it's basically a way of tracking year over year, where is the information coming from and who's the best person on staff to help with questions about this information. That can be really helpful, especially if you see staff turnover, making sure that you have a sense of continuity, because even some simple points of data, if you're calculating it in slightly different ways, you might get different outcomes. And the goal is that you want consistency year over year there. Now, that being said, some of you might have, there are highly sophisticated systems that can support all of this work. There are systems that are built explicitly. They are designed to gather, track, analyze, and report on data. We have a whole team actually at Moss Adams who specializes in helping folks put those types of systems into place. But a lot of the clients that I work with don't have that type of sophisticated system there because they cost money. That is the reality of the situation. And if you don't have the resources for that, a lot of times what you're left with is more manual processes. And you can create fantastic community reports with manual processes as well, or with kind of a mix in between the two. Another piece is having that centralized repository of information. Again, whether that is a shared folder that sits on your intranet that staff have access to, or whether it's one of these systems that is really designed to gather this information, making sure that the data lives in a centralized space rather than out within every individual department can be really helpful. And then finally, thinking about communication and training, that can be as simple as having an annual reminder to the folks who are engaged in this process, a short meeting reminding them what is happening, what their role is, what the deadlines are. That type of thing can make the rest of the work much smoother. And some organizations I work with also do an annual review. If you've had some major new service line that you've added, a new program, you might want to think, do we need to make any changes around the KPIs that we're reporting, around how we have things structured? So just having that little moment before you begin this work to say, is there anything that we need to take into account in terms of operational changes from the past year? This is the data dictionary that I was speaking to earlier. I know it's a little bit small, but this was, again, a basic spreadsheet, but you can see here it's showing, let's say our key performance indicator is employee turnover rate. We have a description that says, what does this mean and why is this important? It is fascinating to me writing these descriptions because sometimes people have very different ideas of what the same piece of information means. So that can be a great kind of aligning tool as you're putting this together. It says who actually owns this data, where is it coming from? In this case, it's the HR department. In this case, there was a year type because some of the data was reported on a calendar year versus a fiscal year. So that can be something to look out for in your data as well. The data source in terms of, is it coming from a specific system? Is it coming from a specific report? And then finally, how is it actually calculated? Like, what are the pieces of information that go in to get this turnover rate? Because in this case, we had to take the number of employees who left the organization over the number of total FTEs. And then we had to talk about what is an FTE and are we doing this based on number of employees versus FTEs? You can see how this can get kind of complex very easily. So having something that says, this is how we calculate it every year, this means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're gathering this information as well. So I know we only have a couple minutes left. I did just want to highlight, sort of as we're thinking about keeping community reports up and running, a lot of times there is this standard annual process where you start with developing the content, the structure of the report. Sometimes this step is very short if you already have things in place. Sometimes this is quite a big step. For those of you who don't have a community report yet, you'd spend a little bit more time here. You develop that content, then you move to the agree section. And this is really where you get buy-in from folks. This is a critical step. Do not forget it. You want everybody on the same page, in particular your management team and your tribal council, in terms of saying what is going into this report so that we're all going to be pleased at the end of this process. Then actually putting it into practice, producing the report, getting it out to the community, seeing how it landed, seeing if you got feedback from community members, seeing if you got feedback from staff about how easy or how difficult it was to pull certain information. And then finally, making updates, thinking about what worked really well in the past year, what might we want to change moving forward. I know we got a question here around consistency. How important is it to have our report be totally consistent year after year? And I would say a lot of times what we'll see is that the bulk of the report, there is consistency because you want to be able to track trends over time. That's really, really helpful. But we also want to give ourselves enough flexibility to make changes to make this better every year. So I would say don't be scared of making changes. Sometimes you do need actually a wholesale change where you are completely starting from scratch. Every once in a while, that's okay. Ideally, you're not doing that every other year. Rather that we'd see some trends over time. You have the same consistent information reported at least 3, 4, 5 years in a row so that you, again, can see some of those trends. But I would say certainly lean into having a mix here because we want this to be a living process where you're sort of repeatedly coming back and saying, how can we improve this? How can we make this better and more relevant for our community members? So I think we are almost at time here. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to most of the other questions. Any last thoughts, Kate, that you want to share with the group? Any last takeaways before we hand it back over to Danielle?
No, I think that what you just hit right there was making sure to bring your community members in and getting their feedback. I think that's another way that you can really make sure that the report and information you're getting to them is what they would like to see, and you can work together.
Great. All right, well, we have our very last polling question here, and this is, we are interested in what you might be interested in exploring in the future. Do you want to do a deep dive on selecting those KPIs, creating reports that are structured around goals, tools for designing, actually making the visual designs there, or creating processes to make community reports more efficient, or something else entirely? So Kate, any final predictions on what you think might come through on this last piece?
I don't know, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of potential answers here, and they're all really good. I know for me, I would probably be interested in, the types of things that could make it more efficient, just because I know that time's not always just money, time is time, but being able to streamline this process to help make it effective would be really important. But I mean, a lot of it starts with all of the individual pieces that are also the other things that you can select from this list. So definitely interested to see what the results are. Cool.
Great. So it looks like we have a good spread here. Thank you all so much for your feedback, your input today. This was really great. We really appreciate your time and energy to be here with us, and we are looking forward to the next one. So Danielle, back over to you.
Thank you, Annie Rose and Kate, for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we'd be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Annie Rose or Kate directly. Their contact information is in your console and right here on your screen. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you have any difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here is a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is appreciated so we can make the most out of your time with us. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, everybody.